everyone. Welcome to the APP series on entering awards. I have with us Paul Hoelen, who is an incredible photographer, covers a whole lot of different genres, and has been a judge and has entered awards for many, many years. I'll have Paul share a little bit more about the background there. But I'm so pleased to have Paul with us so that he can share with us about entering, maybe take away some of that fear and give you a few pointers on what to look for in a great entry. So welcome, Paul. So good to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. It's a cool wintry night in Hobart, and I'm snuggled up with the heater going, and I'm actually in printing mode tonight myself for the APP Awards because I'm literally on the plane to New Zealand, and it's my last chance to be at home and have my own access to my own printing equipment. So I'm right in the mindset for it.
Awesome. We can't wait to see those prints come in. And, you know, the awesome thing about these awards that is very, very different to many other awards that you may have entered before is that you can enter them just as prints and you don't have to get organised with the matting of all of that as well.
Yeah, so I was pretty excited. I've been a part of a lot of different awards over the years, and particular the RPP, which is one of it was probably the premier print awards in Australia, and it's just so gorgeous to experience images and how they're really meant to be appreciated in print form, and to have something that like the APP, which is now continuing and championing that part, is really exciting for me. And so it didn't take any untwisting at all for me to put my hand up to be involved, and I love print, and being able to judge print as well is incredible.
Yeah.
There's a lot of awards that I judge, and you're just sitting at home and watching images on a screen, and it's just not the same. So what I was really excited when I saw the introduction of the APP Awards is the celebration of print and the inclusivity of and the lowering of barriers to engage with kind of an awards system, which it can be a bit intimidating at times. And I think they've got a wonderful separation where they have the digital awards where it's amateur only, so they're not going to have to try and compete against the best of the best, which sometimes can happen in a lot of competitions, and it's a bit intimidating. So I feel like it's beautifully open in that regard, and like a lot of awards aren't necessarily that way inclined. And then secondly, if you want to engage in the print process, you can. And I personally thrive on it and love it. And there's nothing quite like bringing an image to life in physical print form. The tactile aspects that, I really do kind of think that's the form that images were at least traditionally meant to be engaged with and appreciated. And there's a legacy in print that doesn't really exist in zeros and ones on a screen to me personally, as much as I appreciate kind of the archival quality that we're leaning into with digital world. It's just gorgeous. And to be able to physically judge print is one of a great passion of mine and an absolute delight to see incredible images sort of in these beautiful forms and different sort of papers, and they sing a different kind of song actually, translating from a screen to a print. And it's almost like not a different craft, but there is an element of craftsmanship to it that is well worth learning and engaging with. So thank you guys, Karen and Robin in particular, for creating such an accessible platform. And again, relative to other awards, the print aspect, which used to be quite formalized with matting and so on, which added a lot of cost, is I really appreciate how you've just made it. It's just an A3 print and just send it in a box. And all of a sudden, the cost and accessibility of competing and celebrating print form is so much easier. So hats off to you guys.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I hope that this engages people that have never entered print into awards before, that they can now just take that little step. And what you're going to share now is, I think, going to be of great inspiration to them. I would love to hear a little bit more before you go into your presentation, just a little bit more of your experience and background as a judge and as an entrant.
Oh yeah, it goes back a fair way. There's one image in the presentation that tells a lot about that story, so I might leave a little bit of it to that, so I'm not doubling up. But I guess, I've been photographing for a long time, maybe 25, 30 years, and a huge part of that was on my own. and I never really shot with anybody else. So I was largely kind of landscape focused in those days, and these days much broader. But it was a very solo pursuit, and I came across the idea of some awards in Tasmania about 13 years ago, and I met a lady that kind of took me under her wing and brought me along to some of the meetings and some of the critique nights, and I was, oh, isn't it great being in a room with other photographers? And what are they doing to translate kind of their voice into a form that's communicating very successfully and celebrating what they love and inspiring each other to grow and evolve. And I think that's what really caught me. I'm very driven to grow and expand my abilities and skills. And what an award system do, any kind really, it gives you the motivation to engage with your work, to reflect on your work, to critique your own work, and to push yourself every time you enter. And without having a consistent platform like that to do that, it's quite hard to motivate yourself on your own sometimes. And to be able to do that collectively and in a community as well has since become one of the most beautiful parts of my career, actually, as a photographer. And that when you start attending awards, and particularly something like the APP, where you can physically come and enter, when you can listen and see like live panels of some of the best judges, that there's no other way to access that kind of knowledge and that kind of atmosphere around photographic imagery that I'm aware of in the world. And I can't tell you how much I've grown as an image maker by deliberately engaging and pushing myself and being involved with that. And the relationships, the friendships, the mentoring, the critiquing, even the projects that I've now engaged with, all have come through my choice and willingness to have a go and to take a bit of a gamble and a risk. And it takes courage and a bit of vulnerability to engage in putting, your deep personal work out there. And it often is deep personal work, not necessarily always commercial work. So I really respect that part of it. But if you don't have any skin in the game, you kind of don't learn, and you don't really grow, and you don't push yourself to evolve. So tonight I just put something together quite simple in terms of just reflecting on what I think are some of the qualities to look for and maybe aim for, and that it might help you refine some of the choices you make in terms of what you enter and why. How does that sound, Karen?
Awesome, Paul. I'll just switch over. I'll cut this one up. So, Paul, we're going to go into your presentation, and thank you so much for preparing these images and these visual cues of what people should be looking for in their work, maybe some ideas that might spur them on to find something in their collection that they didn't even consider. So I am going to share screen now and pop you up there. All right. Over to you, Paul.
Ready to roll. So again, simple presentation, but I'll flesh things out and give you a little bit of more depth behind why I've chosen what I've chosen. And again, I didn't. How do I want to rephrase this? It's a fine line between when you're starting out and you're thinking, oh, what are people going to like in images? What are the judges going to like? And it's quite a far cry sometimes from what inspires me and what do I feel motivated to express and communicate. And there's quite a bit of a dance between that, particularly when you haven't entered before and you're not quite sure how to navigate or how it's going to be received, and you're kind of nervous about that feedback. And that's very natural, and that will happen. And to be honest, that still happens to me 20 years down the track. It's just part of the game. But if as you grow and you practice and you don't mind kind of putting your ego aside just a little bit, like the APP offers potentially a lot of feedback, particularly the live judging, if you're in that aspect of it, that is rare to be able to access. And if you can kind of put your kind of little ego aside, it's like, oh my God, am I going to bomb? Am I going to fail? And you're just like, well, wait a minute, why don't I just listen and get some feedback and use that as tools to grow? And it's rare to get access to that level of feedback in particular. And so if you can find a way to kind of, one, have the courage to enter, and two, maybe just let it go a little bit once you've entered and just kind of roll with what happens, you'll probably find it much less of a roller coaster and a little bit more enjoyable, and maybe you'll learn a lot more from it. So I think any sort of photographic prize, you just to get what I call the P's and Q's out of the way, is there's certain things you just want to get right that are very logistical, like don't send an image that's out of date for the relevance of what's in the awards. And this one is 5 years from somewhere in July, isn't it, Karen? 18th of July, is it? I think we're close to around there. You can look on the site and then have a look at the category descriptions and make sure that your images fit clearly inside them. There is a little bit of room to a little nudge areas, and there's some images that don't necessarily fit squarely in categories, and that's going to happen all the time. And you can potentially reach out to the organisers if you've got an issue with that beforehand, which I recommend, rather than sort of worrying the whole time about if it is. Some categories often have requirements or at least the options to add description, particularly in things like nature categories where they have quite scientific methodology sometimes with the type of imagery that's created. So if you're going to do it, do a decent job of it, or maybe get someone to help you write it. And again, it's only often short, like 25 words, I think, for these awards. But if you're going to do it, it's worth doing reasonably well and doing something that's adding rather than taking away or distracting from what the image is about. And it's not about waxing lyrical about what your emotional content of the image is. It's often more of a descriptive aspect, but you can lean into the strengths of your image and what you're trying to communicate through the words as well. Quite potentially, if you do well, often you get asked for a raw file, and I think with these rules it says you've got 24 hours to provide that. So if you don't know where it is, or it's on some hard drives at your mum's up the road, then you might get tripped up. So if you're going to put an entry in, it probably makes sense to make sure you have access to the raw files as well, just so you don't have to worry about that later. So that's a little bit of P's and Q's. So I'm going to start flipping through some images and speak to maybe some of the qualities that, and they're my images, so I'm quite personally involved and engaged with the images, and it's kind of an asset and a challenge at the same time. You get pretty close to your own work. And I'll speak a little bit later about the potential benefits of widening the scope of how you make your decision process about what you enter, and including people you trust and respect in terms of their own opinion, because you can get a judge isn't necessarily going to understand or witness or know the story behind your image, or that you walked for 3 days in a storm and climbed a mountain, or it's not going to be in there, and it's not necessarily part of what they even see in the image. So my point is, you can be very invested in your own imagery and what it's taken to create it on a personal level that isn't necessarily what a judge is going to either going to see or engage with. And by using other people around you to get some feedback, you can help kind of just step back from your work a little bit. Sometimes I might step away from images for a while, get a collection together you're inspired by, and then maybe take a break for a little while and come back to it. But be a little bit selective about who you're running past, and you don't necessarily have to listen to what they have to say. But at the same time, it can be a good sounding board. But I think any image aiming for simplicity it sounds simple. Funny that I choose that word, but simplicity is probably one of the hardest things you can achieve, to be honest. And I think it's about considering what you don't put in an image as much as what you do. And I think cropping is a really powerful tool that we all have at our disposal to use to help simplify images. And then a little bit, I guess, conceptually when you're looking at what you want to create. So here the fog has deeply, deeply simplified this image, because if there was no fog, there would be all these distracting elements in and around and behind the scene that would take you away from that beautifully curvaceous kind of graphic, almost lyrical kind of feeling. And also, of course, the fog adds a sort of atmospheric sort of element. And I think it's a beautifully simple image, and it feels quite contained. And this particular image, I think, has qualities of serenity, and it's an unusual kind of perspective on an everyday object. And I think that can often be quite intriguing to judges in particular, and to all of us as visual artists. Impact is always going to have a role, and impact can come through color, it can come through design, it can come through composition. It's not necessarily one particular thing which creates impact, but you kind of know when something kind of hits you in the chops when it turns around. And I know as a judge, particularly when something turns around that just kind of hits you in the face, you can't wait to bounce out of your seat and get close to it. And I think that initial impact is really significant. And a lot of the judges have been judging for a long time and they've seen a lot of things. So you need to kind of be present to that. That if something is very, I guess, maybe commonly seen or has been around for a long time, then you really need to think about how you can portray that in a more innovative and unique kind of way. But color is always going to have a role psychologically and otherwise. Color has a role emotionally as well. Like cooler images tend to have a harsher kind of feeling, and warmer images often psychologically have a emotional warmth to them sometimes as well. And you can play with warmth and coolness to create depth in images. Warm tones tend to come forward in an image. Cool tones tend to move further back, and that can help create spatial depth. But color has an emotional content, and that's, I think, when you want to grab someone, then impact is a part of that. And emotion as well. A particular, look on a expression on a face or a graphic scene can have impact as well. So it's a broad word, but it's something to consider. And I think when you're at this level, it's not just, that's kind of the hook in terms of to get the original engagement of a judge. And then they slow down and go, all right, well, what is this image communicating? And what are the details in here that are adding more? What is it trying to communicate? And that's where things get a little bit more depthful. So this image is an interesting one for me. I think I shot it at about 4:30 in the morning, about -5 degrees, and my hand physically stuck to the tripod. It was so cold, and it was quite a commonly photographed thing at the time. But I wanted to create a different take on it, and to me, I was really, really drawn to this kind of beautiful, almost spiritual connotation. I call this image ascension. It almost feels like that's a cenotaph down the bottom where we're honoring the death of all the soldiers, and to me the lighting kind of gave this sense of ascension of these souls kind of rising to heaven, and it was beautifully, deeply symbolic, and it almost brought me to tears when I created it, and I put it in an awards in New Zealand, and it, to my mind, it bombed. I was like, oh man, like I was so invested in this image, and I was quite deflated, and I just thought, you know what, I actually really believe in this image, and I'm going to back it again. And I put it in the Australian Awards, and the first judge came out and gave it 98. And I was just like, whoa, somebody saw it. Somebody saw what I was trying to communicate, which isn't always going to happen with a judging panel, because there's elements of some images that are only connected to by certain people that have had certain life experiences, or that see visually some aspects of an image that might speak to a life experience of their own, or a homage to an artist that they're really close with, and you have no control over that. So my point about faith is, it's having a go is a little bit about backing yourself. And sometimes if I don't do well, I don't do well, but I really love that image, and I really appreciate celebrating it. And by putting it into the awards, it's a conversation piece I can then engage with other people as well. So there's that line between, thinking it's going to do well and just having faith that it might, and then just actually letting it go once you push the send button. And so when Karen asked me originally, like, what was my story around my relationship with the awards? Well, this image has a huge story with my personal relationship. This is the first image I ever entered in both the Tasmanian Awards and eventually the Australian Awards. And I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I never printed anything basically of quality in my life, not for an awards. Didn't know anything about papers. And one of the judges saw this image, a few of them, and I think they gave it 89. They couldn't quite give it a gold because it wasn't printed as well as it could be. And knowing nothing about papers, they gave me this wonderful feedback, and try this, or maybe try that, or you can add depth by this, or this paper choice might bring this out. And I listened, and I engaged with that, and I took it to the Australian Awards, nervous as anything, never been there, flew myself up there, didn't know a single person. Actually knew one person, I knew Alan Moyle. Actually, Bruce Moyle's brother. Bruce is one of the presenters for APP. And I was so nervous about walking in there. I walked around for 2.5 hours before I even went into the awards. I was so nervous. And I walked in, and Alan saw me, and he waved my hand over here, and he said, "Oh, is that your image?" And I was like, "Yeah, yeah." And he said, "Well, so far it's a high scoring print in Australia." And I was like, oh. I just started crying on the spot. I was like, oh my God, I can still feel it now. And all of a sudden, all these people were pointing at me and coming up saying, "Who's this guy? Who's this guy?" And that night, I got invited out to dinner. Didn't know who anybody was, and it turned out I was having dinner with Tony Hewitt and Kristen Fletcher and all these like absolute legends, and they were just a bit curious about who this guy is. And it all came from just having a bit of courage and having a go. And in terms of that word feedback, I hadn't chosen that image, and it was because I had a series of images that I was thinking about, and I ran it past some people. One of my other mates said, "What about this one?" And I actually didn't engage with it as much. It was in the loop, and it was his encouragement that maybe put it in there. And to this date, I think it's the highest scoring image and one of the most awarded images I've ever done in my career. And that came from having a bit of guts. It came from that feedback. It came from the feedback from curation with people I trusted, as well as the feedback I got from judging earlier in terms of what paper choice and how to improve its print quality. So there's a lot of stories around this image, and it speaks a lot to, I guess, it kind of kick-started my career in a lot of ways, in that it became a cover shot and it was used in articles, and it had a really big impact in terms of me having the courage to move into more of a full-time professional role. I mean, that's a very personal story, but if I have a single image in my career that has done that, then this is it, actually. I don't remember taking that photograph. I was at the Burning Man Festival, and I don't think I'd slept for 3 days. I can't remember where I was. I think I even shot it as a JPEG. So on a point-and-shoot camera, so it's kind of like, you don't have to be on top of everything to create a powerful image. Sometimes it's something in the moment that just arrives and the stars align, and this was a little bit like that for me. So big story behind that image, but it ties in with what Karen was asking earlier. So sometimes, particularly like a documentary category, or a decisive moment is really important, and a judge is going to be thinking, is this the decisive moment in the context of the environment? Could it have been done closer? Would it be more impactful if it was positioned from here? Like often, particularly with documentary work, closer is almost always better. And literally here, I got basically knocked over and got sandaled through my camera and kicked in my face. That's how close I was. And it was a millisecond of a moment that I caught here, and it ended up being a magazine cover, actually. And it's very much a decisive moment. It's really there. I love the it's an underpants race, if you didn't figure it out, in the middle of a bareback horse riding competition in a very remote area of New Zealand that's been running for I think 70 years. And just they've got this unusual tradition in the middle of the bareback horse races to run an underpants race. I don't know where it came from. So it's kind of hilarious and a little bit in your face. But timing wise, it's very much about a moment. And I think as much as we get caught up with gear and that kind of thing, no matter what camera you use or don't use, it cannot tell you when to push a shutter button. That is totally up to you, and that will probably never change. And I think that's worth being present to. So, just be present to that when you're choosing images, particularly that have a lot of movement or dynamism in them. Is just, and maybe if you have a sequence of images around that you have to choose from, which is a decisive moment. I think partly because judges see so much visual material, I think what engages them more and more and more is, what is the depth of narrative in this image? And does it have a lot of depth? You have that kind of surface aspect to this interesting character in the front, but as you reach deeper into the image, you'll see, oh, what's that symbol in the background? Or what's the material that they're on? Or, oh, look at that interesting figure of the dog. What's the relationship between the two? And there's almost another level of emotion there. What's the writing behind the dog? What does that speak to culturally? And what is on the shirt? And there's this layers and layers and layers of narrative and storytelling aspects in the image that come to life when people spend time with an image. And when you look at a judge, particularly, it's more obvious in physical print when you can see them do it. They're really getting up close. They're really looking at not just the obvious, but the less obvious features. And the more elements that you have to reward their attention, the better. They don't necessarily have to be there. Sometimes the impact is obvious enough with a singular feature, but having other aspects to speak to the story and deepen the story or give breadth to the story is often something that will be rewarded quite well, and that judges will particularly appreciate. And they'll pick up on things that maybe even you might not even notice yourself. a little bit more out there, but I think it helps an image stand out. Is there multiple ways to interpret an image? Is it just obvious? Is there many ways that this could be seen? And to me, this image personally is like that. Is it an ice flow? Is it a weathered storm from a satellite out of space? Is it a petri dish in a science lab? It could be physically interpreted quite a few different ways, quite believably. And I think that is something that it's not always something you can aim to do. And to be honest, I kind of found that retrospectively when I started cropping into the image and isolating a certain part of it. But I really enjoy, personally, to me, this image is about global warming. It's about dynamism, and it's about, that vortex of storm that we're facing as a society and a culture. And there's a symbolism in there in the shape and the movement of the imagery and the detail that can be construed different ways. And again, it has multiple layers and multiple aspects of potential interpretation. And it's sometimes you're a bit lucky to find those in your career or create them. It's not always easy to do. In my case, in a 1 second exposure from 2,500 feet in the air, when the composition changes in 1 second, as opposed to someone like Karen that might spend a long time designing an image and deepening the narrative and the symbolism over time. My way of doing it is in a 1 second capture, so different process but same result. So don't worry about whether it's in there in your image, but it also is something to consider when you're trying to decide whether an image you might choose one, and how can you lean into that aspect of it, maybe even in the way that you work, the features you bring out in post-production through dodging and burning might bring out certain features that lean into that a bit more. I mean, there's a saying that everything's been photographed already, but at the same time, it's always very refreshing for a judge to see something from a different perspective, or a refreshing perspective. And that's commonly said, but not always easy to do. And I was literally just wandering along on the street, and I had a point and shoot camera in my pocket, and I looked up, went, oh, I like that angle. And so I wasn't even looking. I'd seen that building from afar. It's actually in downtown San Francisco, and it's a famous building, but I'd never seen an image of it from that perspective. And it's a play on that planar kind of separation of different aspects of the building that I found quite intriguing, and it has wonderful graphical quality as well, and it's supported by the kind of organic aspect of the clouds as well. And tonally, it's quite deliberately created to lean on those aspects that I wanted to lean on, particularly the graphic elements. But yeah, is it a refreshing perspective? Is it something that's commonly seen or commonly done, or have you shown a bit of innovation, or that you put a bit of thought into how you want to approach the subject, is I guess what I'm leaning on here. So you first thought, what is that? And it's actually a Chinese lantern of a life-size zebra at a Chinese lantern festival that I randomly came across when I was walking back to my car from something else. And what I enjoy about it is it's unusual in that the lighting it's actually lit from within, and it kind of has this kind of effervescent glow about it that's coming through, and you don't have a sense of scale. From a distance, it could be quite conceivably a real life creature. It's a portrait, but it's an original portrait, and it crosses that line. If you didn't know that aspect of what it physically was, you could easily be quite convinced that it's a real life creature, and I think that moves it into a realm of something a bit innovative and a bit original, particularly in the realm of portraiture. And there's so many photographers work in the portrait world, and judges in particular, that they would have seen so much work that, again, it's quite exciting to see something a little bit innovative and particularly original. So I think it depends on how much exposure you have to photography to know what something original is. And sometimes by looking into the past awards, you can get a bit of a sense of maybe over the last few years what's been done, or get a bit more of a sense of the breadth of what's out there, and maybe it might help reflect on, is this an innovative way to view something, or it might just educate yourself a little bit more on the depth of what's been done before you, so you can be a little bit more conscious about how original your work is. You won't always know what's been out there, and we're going to be learning our whole lives on the history of photography and what's been done, particularly when there's almost 1 billion images a day being uploaded online. It's colossal. So how do you be original in a world like that? But you'll kind of get a feeling, and you'll get more of a feeling the more you look around. So this is relevant. I think tonal range is basically the tones between light and dark and everything in between. So it's relevant both in a digital form and in print form. So in digital form, basically, when I'm allowed to say, oh, the image is a bit flat, basically what that generally means is they haven't used the full dynamic range between light and dark that's available within that image's capture. And so you can see on a histogram, if you're familiar with what that is, you can get a real clear sense on where, if all your tone is in one area, or if there's room to move on the darker or the lighter side. And it's worth kind of nudging around those upper and lower areas, and it often gives more contrast and impact to an image. It's not always the aesthetic you're going for, fair enough. Some images want to be kind of soft and more muted, and that's the aesthetic you're going for. But if you are going to lean into a more dynamic image, then make sure you do use the whole of that tonal range. Where it's slightly different from screen to print is you can get away with visually seeing 0 to 255, which is a physical histogram that you'll see in Lightroom and in Photoshop of the values of pure white and pure black. And when you translate to print, you lose a little bit on each end. You kind of have to pull the whites back a tiny bit and pull the dark blacks back a tiny bit, or they'll get lost in translation because it doesn't have the same ability to present and refine the very, very subtle, very high-end aspects of dark and light, essentially. But what you do want to show to a judge is there's a deliberateness of control and understanding about exposure, and that you haven't blown out the highlights because you don't understand how to expose your image correctly, or the detail in the shadows is just gone when actually it would add quite a lot to the story. It's not always important to do that, and it may even reduce the impact through the image, which I'll talk to you about the following one. But it's really worth kind of leaning into, I guess, all the depth of the file that you have on offer to work with. And so that's what I meant by fullness, and control is what I'm referring to as a level of control you have on your highlights and shadow details in particular. So this is an example where it's the opposite. Like pure black is actually what makes this image. And it wouldn't work the same at all or have the same impact if I was trying to pull, a bit of detail out of the shadows. That's really what creates that isolation and that visual impact is the pure black. So it's important to just be honest to the aesthetic and the power of what you're trying to express and communicate. But if it looks like you haven't handled that well or lent into it as well as you could, people, they'll know, and they'll make a decision for themselves whether they think that's a deliberate choice or just maybe not handled. So you're better off not giving them the opportunity to wonder and really leaning into it. So that's my point about that. So having a go. So, sometimes people ask me, oh, geez, you've got an amazing image. You must have a great camera. And I just nod my head quietly and I just say, well, oh, geez, that was a great dinner. You must have a great stove. It's kind of my response. And they just go, oh, and then they kind of get it. Like it's just a box that collects light. It can't tell you how to compose an image. It can't teach you how to understand light. It doesn't tell you when to take the shot, what the decisive moment is, like I referred to earlier. It doesn't teach you how to create a relationship and understanding with your subject that can come through the communication of an image. That is, none of those have anything to do with the camera that you use at all. They're just about you. And so this image I took completely blind, upside down in a plane with a point and shoot camera, and I got what I got in America somewhere, and I got what I got. And I literally didn't even know if I got the shot till I pulled the camera halfway in from the plane. And I was like, oh, that was a good one. And I think I got a golden image at APA, actually judged by Tony Hewitt and Dan O'Day. And I didn't tell anyone. I just shot it randomly on a point and shoot camera blind. And they don't need to know that. So my point is, don't get too caught up in equipment. And even a phone is quite capable of producing the kind of images at the size that are going to be appreciated and judged well in the awards. So yeah, again, just let that barrier kind of slip away a little bit. A good image is a good image, and the caliber of judges will have more of an understanding of the narrative and emotional aspects that will speak beyond the technical if it comes to that. There's a lot of consideration of those elements that isn't about pixel peeping. So if it's a powerful image, it's a powerful image. So in that regard, just, have a go and use what you've got. The best camera in the world is the one you got with you. It's an old saying, but it's still a very appropriate one. I think Robin might be listening to this. Graphic quality rather than graphical is the words I'm using to describe this. Is that graphic qualities have a lot of impact. Here there's a graphic quality in that bold use of just broad color. To me, that's a graphic quality, as well as the linearly graphic qualities and separation into blocks that the area has. There's an impactfulness that comes from isolating and amplifying graphic qualities in your images, and that can come through cropping sometimes, where it leans into those kind of features. So if that's in your image, and often square images lean and lend a more graphic quality to an image and are worth considering. And particularly if you're isolating areas of the image that aren't adding to the photograph, like be really present if something's in an image. Is this adding to it, or is it actually distracting from what the main subject and what the main communication is in the image? So simple, and it may not be relevant to certain images, but it's worth considering. Depth. How do you create depth on a flat piece of paper? It's an ongoing conversation, and there's lots of different ways you can do that. You can do that through light and dark. Like the back of this frame has a bit of lightness, and the human eye is drawn through by lighter areas, and it's right in the back of the frame. So it's actually pulling me through the frame, very subtly in this case, but it is there. Sharpness and where it's sharp can have an impact on depth in an image and where the eye is drawn to. I think the use of leading lines can have a big impact on the sense of spatial depth of an image. And as I alluded to earlier, warm and cool tones, this isn't the right image to speak to that, but warmer tones accentuated and cooler tones accentuated further back in an image can really create a cognitive spatial depth. And actually, there's research on that, how the brain actually responds to those tones in terms of creating spatial depth in the mind. So again, where the sharpness, the light and dark, the way you dodge and burn an image actually, and lead people through the frame through lighter and darker parts of the image is considering as well. And most categories will allow that in terms of a tool that you can use to shape depth in your image and bring depth into an image. And again, in a print form, in some ways it's even more obvious. You've got a few more tools up your sleeve to lean into in terms of the paper stock that you use. So speaking of printing, and because it's a very relevant part of this awards, it's worth kind of leaning into that a little bit. I mean, you could spend 2 hours or half a day with Rocco and Cora or longer leaning into all the elements of it. And some people, I think, they might be printing for the first time or might be entering prints for the first time, and just go for it. At the very least, if you choose to have them sent back, you'll have some beautiful prints of your own anyway. And if you choose to come to the awards, you'll literally get to see them judge live on the wall potentially, which is a pretty exciting thing to do. So paper and paper choices they do have a significant impact on either supporting or accentuating the kind of qualities that you want to speak to in an image. Like a soft matte paper will lend a certain softness and more artistic flavor to an image than a traditional kind of photo luster paper. You can be a little bit tricky in that if you have a lot of noise in your image and you're a bit worried about that coming through, then often a highly textured paper can actually absorb some of that and kind of tuck it away a little bit in the image. If you have a lot of really, really fine detail that is to you really significant and important, then leaning on a really smooth paper that really holds a lot of high detail is important, and you can find that in both luster as well as matte form. If you want sort of high impact, contrast, then maybe leaning towards a paper like Canson Patine, which is has very dark blacks and high contrast or D-max values in the blacks, and a good printer will know about these, is worth leaning into. So you've got a lot of say about how your image comes across aesthetically through print. And if you're not used to it, have a play and go down to your local printer, research who's available locally, You won't want to buy, 10 boxes of different papers to play yourself. It's a bit expensive. But most good printers will have quite a good range, and you can start playing around. Sometimes they'll have books by Harneville or Canson, or even a mixture where you can flick through and actually physically get a feeling for the papers themselves. And they'll have sample images on those papers that suit the aesthetic of that kind. So you can start getting a little bit clearer in your mind. What am I leaning to here? Am I going for a softer, more poetic feel? Am I going for a really punchy, hard kind of feeling? Papers also have different temperatures, and that some are warmer and cooler in terms of their whites, and that can have a subtle kind of impact on the warmth of an image or the coolness or harshness of an image as well. And so it's a long dance to learn that. I actually spent, I think, 5 or 6 years flying over to Melbourne and studying with Les Walkling, who's probably arguably the premier colour management expert and printing expert in Australia for this kind of thing. And that was a long time to figure out how to do it myself. But it's quite satisfying. For the last 10 years, I've printed all my own awards work, and I have a consistent flow. One aspect, if you want to take it on yourself, is understanding and learning about color management. There's lots of different steps on the way, from what you have on the back of your screen and camera to what you see on your screen of the computer to what translates onto the print and paper. And they can all subtly change and shift if you don't have an understanding and control over color management, in particular using calibrated screens. I won't go into that now because that's a bit more technical, but if you're going down that path, there's people like Rocco and Cora who I think are running capture to print workshops consistently. People like Les Walkling. I think there's others, Karen, that you alluded to, that are maybe speaking to that in the show.
Yep, yep.
But it does have an impact. And also it can be really fun playing around and trying things out. Um, Lighting is something to consider, in that what you print and have on a wall at home is often going to be or even in a gallery, is often a lot darker than the lighting that's going to be judged in. So you can actually find out the physical measurements for light, and some people even set up consistent lighting to have a sense of, how is it going to look in the quite bright light, a relatively bright light that it's judged under. And so when you are thinking about your image, just consider that it's going to be, even just stepping outside on a bright sunny day, is going to give you the kind of idea, relatively speaking, of the kind of brightness that's going to be on your image. And so it'll reach into those shadow areas maybe more than you're expecting, for instance, and it will blow out areas that are maybe what they call too hot, or too close to pure white. Don't stress about it, and again, it's a bit more, that's kind of a bit more down the advanced route. But if you want to go down that route, there's ways that you can find out the exact kind of lighting measurements of what is going to be judged under. And again, very, very simply, when you're looking at an image on a screen, it's basically a light projection, and there's so much light beaming through that, it's amazing. And the reality of translating to print is it's a flat, two-dimensional piece of paper where the only light is what's reflected off it. And that actually changes, can significantly change the level of contrast and punch in your image. Often, if you're not aware of that, your image will come off a little bit flatter and less contrasty than you're expecting. And it takes a little bit of time, or maybe a good printer, to maybe adjust for that. And there's a thing called color profiles that basically they recognize the specific qualities of the paper you're using and adjust accordingly to how it's going to translate from your screen onto print. So there's much less issue in the translation from one to the other. And pretty much all high-end working printers have accommodated for that these days. So if you're printing somewhere else, or with a good printer, that's not something you need to worry about too much. But just be aware in that translation. And if you suddenly get back, that's way darker or less punchy or duller than I thought it was going to be, that's kind of to be expected to some extent, but there are ways around managing that. So I don't know, Karen, if you've got anything else you want to add, that's kind of close to what I wanted to cover today, apart from the fact that it's a lot of fun if you really engage with it, and what I call having some skin in the game. Like, if you're in a room with people that have poured their life and heart into images, and it's live and there's all this atmosphere, it's quite electric, and it's pretty exciting, and it's really dynamic. Whether you bomb or do well or get a gold or don't get anything, it's you'll meet a lot of people, you'll be around the camaraderie of like-minded, creatives. You'll get to mingle with some of the best. You'll see other people's prints up close and personal. There's a lot of social events in the APP that are organized in particular, which are, and I couldn't tell you the amount of richness that's come into my life from being involved in the different awards. I've actually gone around every state in Australia judging, and I've pretty much got beds to sleep on around the whole country, and people that I can consider mentors and friends. And a lot of them I've done creative projects with that I never would have met otherwise if I didn't sort of trundle on out there on that first time with that first print, knowing nobody, and have a bit of a go. So, it's a significant thing to be part of a community, and because photography can be quite a soloist pursuit, a lot of the time for most of us. So yeah, I could ramble on about that for hours. So I think, Karen, you're right if I stop sharing screen now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. That was absolutely fantastic, and it's so true. The reason that Robin and I decided to go ahead and plan the Australian Photographic Prize is primarily because of community, because we missed it, because it was lost, and we can't wait to bring everyone back together, to see you, to see all the people that are coming along, to judge, to participate, to speak. It's going to be quite amazing, and we've missed it. I mean, we've been locked down for so many years, and it's just like this big hole, isn't it? So it's just so important. And I've had a similar experience to you in just finding that community. I haven't been in that community for as long as you have, but it actually feels like I have. It's just, you got the best friends. So yeah.
Couldn't put a value on it. Just priceless, absolutely priceless in my life, like for many, many, many reasons. So yeah, at the very least, you'll have a good time and make some new friends, and celebrate and learn from some great speakers, and see some
Yeah.
beautiful work. And I'm quite conscious that Melburnians in particular have been the most locked down city in the world, and I love that it's being hosted there as well to kind of break the mold of that as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That is so true. Yeah. No, we just want to encourage everyone to come along. So to not, as you said at the start of your presentation, Paul, it's not just about watching stuff being judged online, and we will be live streaming the judging because we do realize that not everyone can be there, but we're wanting people to come. This is something where you can come, you can be part of that action. There's been times when I've had my work judged and I've just sat there in the crowd, and I have the Apple Watch, and I realised that one of my prints was being judged. My Apple Watch started going, "Your heart rate is way too high," and it was doing an alarm thing, and it was up at like 135. And it was
get in the
just
game,
this
get in the game, Karen.
adrenaline.
It's what makes it exciting and interesting, and
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. It's worth it. It's
And
worth the fast heart rate.
I won't lie, it can be a roller coaster. I've had some of my biggest
Yeah.
highs and my lowest lows through the whole thing. But and as I get a bit older and done it more often, that roller coaster is a little bit lower because I'm like, all right, been there before.
Yeah.
Yeah, total bomb. Walk of shame. Whatever it is. It's if you can laugh at yourself in
Yeah.
anything in life, you're doing well, and you're
Yeah.
keeping the door open to learn and grow. So I do. I will attest to that.
Yes.
Philosophically and literally.
Yep, definitely. Well, Paul, thank you. Thank you again for everything, for sharing, and we can't wait to have you speak at the Australian Photographic Prize, judge, and just be a part of the whole thing. So thank you very much for joining us for this.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to it. Like, as I know, like you can probably feel the authenticity and emotion in my voice. This is a genuine, real deal for me. I'm just
Yep.
so thirsty to dive back into community and to celebrate what I love with people that love the same thing, and just bring that back to life. I
Yep.
felt a bit alone, I guess, in the last year or so, and I'm doubling up. I'm flying over to the New Zealand Awards. I'm literally packing my bags, and I'll be coming straight from there to these ones. So I'll be getting a double dose, and I'll be pretty fresh. pretty
Yeah.
freshly up to date with judging it again, which would be great.
Yeah, awesome. Well, all the best for New Zealand, for the New Zealand Awards, for everything that you're doing there, and for the entries that you've put in there too. Yeah, can't wait to see your successes. Thank you, Paul.
My pleasure. See you there, everyone.
See you there.